Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I have used this fabric that was left over from my jumpsuit to skater dress video and used it to create a cowl neck top with a lace up back. I really liked this fabric and didn't want to waste it. Tops like these have been really popular over the last few years and continue to be, so I thought I'd have a go at making my own as part of my summer wardrobe. So let's get into it. First, with the fabric inside out, I cut along all the seams to have 4 separate pieces of fabric. I used a seam ripper to do this, as I wanted to save as much fabric as possible, but scissors are fine. This is what I had. First, I made my front piece. Taking a top I like the fit of, I placed this onto my piece of fabric with the bottom edge lined up with the bottom edge of the fabric. Luckily for me, my piece of fabric was the right size, so I didn't need to cut anything. But if you need to cut your fabric, cut a square around your top, making sure the top edge of your top lines up with the top edge of your fabric. This was my front piece. On to making the back pieces. Taking the top I like the fit of, I placed this onto a second piece of fabric. This time with the back of the top facing up and making sure the bottom edge lined up with the bottom edge of the fabric. I marked onto my fabric where the back of the top started and connected these points with a straight line. I then cut along the line I had just drawn. Next, I folded this piece of fabric in half and cut along the folded edge. These are my 2 back pieces. I now had my front piece and my 2 back pieces. Starting with the front piece, I turned this over so the wrong side of the fabric was facing up. I then needed to hem all the edges. I did this by folding them over 1/4 inch and pinning them in place. Once I'd done this for all the edges, I sewed where I'd pinned. Moving on to the back pieces. Again, I folded these over so the wrong side of the fabric was facing up. For these pieces, I only needed to hem 3 of the edges, as one of the sides will be attached to the front piece. Again, I folded these over 1/4 inch and pinned these in place. I then sewed where I'd pinned. This is what I had so far. I could now attach the back pieces to the front piece. With the right side of the front piece facing up, I took one back piece and placed this onto the front piece with the right sides facing down, making sure the edge I didn't hem was against the edge of the front piece and the bottom edges of both pieces lined up. I then pinned this in place and repeated this for the second back piece on the other side. I then sewed these pieces in place. This is how it looked once it was sewn. Next, I needed to make the loops for the lace up back. Taking a piece of fabric, I measured and marked out 10 pieces that were 1.5 inches wide and 4 inches long. I then cut these out. Taking each of these pieces, I folded them in half, right sides together, and pinned along the long edge. Once I'd done this for each piece, I sewed where I'd pinned. This is how they looked once they were sewn. I then turned these inside out so they were now the right way round. I used a safety pin to help me do this. These are my 10 pieces. I could now attach these pieces to my top, 5 on each side. With the wrong side of the fabric facing up, I took one of these pieces and folded it in half to create a loop. I placed this so it lined up with the top edge of the fabric and pinned it in place. Taking a second piece, I did the same thing to create a loop and place this one so it lined up with the bottom edge of the fabric, and pinned this in place. For the third piece, I placed it halfway between the first two, and for the last two, I placed these so they were evenly spaced out between the middle loop and the ones on each end. This is how they looked once they were all pinned in place. I then repeated this for the other 5 on the other side. I then sewed where I'd pinned. This is how the top looked so far. Next, I needed to make the long tie for the back of the top. Taking another piece of my fabric, I first decided how long I wanted my tie to be. I decided on 50 inches. I measured the width of my fabric to see how many strips I would need to make the tie. My fabric was 13.5 inches long. I took the 50 inches I wanted my tie to be and divided this by the length of my fabric, which was 13.5 inches. This gave me 3.7, so I needed 4 strips to make my tie. I measured and marked out 4 pieces that were 13.5 inches long and 1.5 inches wide. I then cut these out. This is how they looked. I then took each of these pieces, placed them right sides together and pinned along the short edge. I then sewed where I'd pinned. I now had one long piece of fabric. I then folded this in half, right sides together, and pinned along the long edge. I then sewed where I'd pinned to make a long tube. Once it was sewn, I turned it inside out so it would be the right way round. Again, I used a safety pin to do this. I now needed to lace up the back of my top. Starting at the top, I fed the tie through each top loop. I then fed it through each loop on the opposite side of the top, creating a crossover look until I reached the bottom. The lace up part of the top was done, and the final thing I needed to do was make the straps. While trying the top on, I worked out how long the straps needed to be. With the strap starting from the top corner on the front of the top, I measured over my shoulder to the top corner on the back of the top. This measurement was 16 inches, but I added an inch for seam allowance, so I now had 17 inches. Using what I had left of my fabric, I measured 4 pieces that were 10 inches long and 1.5 inches wide. I thought it would be easier to make the straps 20 inches long, then cut them to the right length afterwards. This is how they looked. Taking 2 of these pieces, I placed them right sides together and pinned along the short edge. I then repeated this for the other 2 pieces and sewed where I'd pinned. This is how they looked. Next, I folded these in half, right sides together and pinned along the long edge. Once everything was pinned in place, I sewed where I'd pinned. Again, I turned these inside out so they were now the right way round. This is what I had. I could now attach these to my top. First, I cut these straps to the length I needed them to be, which was 17 inches. Next, I pinned one end of one strap to the top front corner. I then repeated this for the other top front corner. Then, going back to the first strap, I pinned the other end to the top corner on the back of the top and repeated this for the second strap. I then sewed these in place. I sewed the straps on by hand as I would have more control this way, but you can use a sewing machine if you wanted to. Once the straps were sewn on, the top was complete and this is how it looked. I was so happy with how this top looked and I loved the pattern on the fabric. This top was so simple to make, but I think it looks professionally made and is also a great way to use leftover fabric. It can easily be dressed up or dressed down, depending on what occasion you want to wear it to. I've paired mine with a pair of high-waisted black jeans for a casual everyday look. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.